Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. A very warm welcome to this event this morning, which has been organised by Care International. We're very glad to have you here. My name is Frances Longley. I'm the Executive Director for Programmes and Policy at Care International UK, and I'll be hosting and moderating this event today. As a first step, could I please just ask everybody to turn off their video and put themselves on mute, partly so we don't get too distracted by your stunning backgrounds in many cases, but also just to help us keep the bandwidth down. Thank you. We are recording this session, as you'll have seen when you signed in. So as you remain as part of this session, we take that as your permission that you're happy to be included in that recording. We have a panel of 6 fantastic speakers for you today, and we'll start our discussion shortly with our first 3 speakers, and then the other 3 speakers will have a chance to respond. And then at the end, it's your turn. We'll have a Q&A session for all, where you can address questions to any of our panelists at the end. So if you have questions, please put them into the chat box during the course of the event. We won't be taking questions at all until the end. So please put your questions in the chat. It's helpful if you can put your name and your organisation if that's relevant. And if your question is addressed to a specific speaker, please make that clear as well. And we'll curate the questions and I will then place them to the panelists at the end of the session. Okay, on to today's subject. This conversation is bringing together 3 areas of great importance to Care's work: climate change, gender justice, and of course the current COVID-19 crisis. COVID-19 is one of the biggest disruptors to sustainable development, human rights, and gender equality in our lifetimes. People who are the most vulnerable and marginalised, particularly women and girls, both in developed and developing countries, are the hardest hit by both COVID-19 and climate change. COVID-19 recovery measures provide huge potential for jointly tackling the COVID-19 and climate crises, particularly through stimulus packages, which could be mobilised to accelerate the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energies, to build resilience and to address gender inequality. This will require women, particularly those most affected by climate change and COVID, to have a meaningful voice in how these policies and spending decisions are shaped. Care's research and long-term experience of delivering climate adaptation programmes tell us that programmes and policies that do support women's voices are more likely to take into account their needs, promote gender equality, and benefit communities overall. However, we know that currently women are consistently being left out of key decision-making spaces in both the COVID and climate crises. Care's recent research has found that on average, women are just 24% of national decision-making bodies on COVID-19, and that local women-led and women's rights organisations remain chronically underfunded. This matters. If governments fail to make their economic stimulus gender responsive, sustainable and equitable, they will drive our planet much deeper into the existential economic, social and ecological turmoil caused by the climate crisis. So this is the context for our discussion today, and it's my pleasure to introduce our first set of speakers. So I will just read a brief introduction to each of our first speakers, and then we'll hand over and start the conversation. Our first speaker is Franceline Jimenez. Franceline is the project manager for the Increase programme at Care Philippines, which supports the resilience of farmers and fisherfolk to disaster, climate change and environmental hazards. She joined Care Philippines in 2017 to lead Tukless Innovation Labs. That's a platform to support innovative solutions in disaster preparedness. Franceline has also led other care initiatives, including the START Network-funded Anticipatory Action on Volcanic Risks and Emergency Response for Typhoons Mangkhut and Kamuri in 2018 and 2019. Prior to joining CARE, she supported local governments in developing disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation plans. I'm very grateful that she's joined us today. Our second panelist is Hilda Flavia Nakabuye. Hilda is a leading African climate and environmental rights activist. She is a founder and organizer of Fridays for Future Uganda, missing classes every Friday to strike for climate action. She has spoken at international conferences such as COP25 and the C40, and also in schools around the world to mobilize students. Currently, she's running a youth-led COVID-19 emergency fund to support vulnerable people during the crisis. Very glad Hilda's able to join us this morning. And our third speaker is Abul Kalam Azad. Abul is the Special Envoy of Bangladesh's Climate Vulnerable Forum presidency. Abul has over 34 years of experience in the civil service of Bangladesh, including serving as the Secretary of the Ministry of Power and Principal Secretary of the Prime Minister. He's also acted as the Principal Coordinator of the Sustainable Development Goals for the Prime Minister's Office, playing a unique role in incorporating the SDGs into policies from the national to the local level. So that's our first three speakers, and I'm going to ask each of them to respond to our first question, which is, what do climate justice and gender justice mean to you? And what do you see are the links between them, particularly in your context? So if I can give that question first to Francine, please.
Yeah, hi, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Francine Jimenez from CARE Philippines. So usually when we talk about gender justice, we always talk about, people enjoying equal rights, freedom and access to opportunities and resources. And looking at where women and girls are during disasters and in our efforts toward climate resilience, we can see that much can still be done towards that goal. In the Philippines, we've seen that in crisis-hit communities where resources are scarce and the need for social cohesion is high, it's usually the women who position themselves to gather and organize community members to work together. This is an experience we've seen time and time again in previous disasters, and we are seeing this now as we all cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. I think for us to continue women leadership, whether in dealing with disasters or with climate emergency or with the COVID pandemic, we need to ensure that women and girls are actively engaged in informal and formal decision-making spaces. And we also need to work together to transform the social and institutional structure so that the needs, concerns, and wants of future generations of women and girls will be heard, considered, and acted upon. This is a big ask for us, and this is a big ask that's quite relevant as we grapple with the different disasters, climate emergency, and COVID-19 pandemic happening to us. But it's something that I'm quite excited to see and experience in the communities that we work with. So that's it for me, Frances. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. So Hilda, can I put that question to you as well? What do climate justice and gender justice mean to you? And what do you see are the links between them, particularly in your context?
Thank you, Frances. And first and foremost, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. I'm glad to be sharing with you today, and thanks to the organizers for having me here today. And according to that question, as a victim of this whole climate crisis, when I look at developed countries, well, many questions come to my mind. I ask myself if they are aware that when they pollute, it's poor countries who pay for their actions. There's a global climate crisis that is happening, but it did not happen overnight and surely not by itself. Some people and countries are behind it. The planet has endured many years of abuse from the very people who are supposed to protect it. But what are we doing? We keep talking about democracy, human rights, justice, but where is justice when extreme weather events are killing innocent people in the global south, even as I speak right now? Developed countries have a historical responsibility in polluting our planet. Why don't they take responsibility of cleaning the mess they created? why don't they support developing countries in adaptation and mitigation measures in renewable energy technologies? That's climate justice to me. We all know that we cannot overcome the unprecedented challenges facing humanity with half of the population left on the sidelines. Climate change has exacerbated the existing gender inequality, more especially in Africa, where girls are still kept in the waiting lodges. I ask myself if an African young woman means anything to them. I am not only a victim of the climate crisis, but gender inequality too. It is not possible to have gender justice without climate justice. We see that 80% of the people displaced by climate change are women. This is in the UN via BBC. This shows that there is no climate justice without gender justice. Thank you, Frances.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Hilda. And now I'm going to pose the same question to Abul. What do climate justice and gender justice mean to you? And what do you see are the links between them, particularly in your context?
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. We lost you for a moment,
Yes.
but we can hear you better now.
So climate justice means that the poor, the most affected and threatened by climate change, who contributed the least to the problem and supported by the different organizations. It also means that those who are responsible clean up their acts. This means taking radical action to reduce pollution that's behind the harm. I'm pleased to represent Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, who is the chair of Climate Vulnerable Forum and who has been a champion in gender and climate. In Bangladesh, we have achieved credible progress. For instance, in the education sector, with a nearly 100% enrollment rate for girls in school and gender parity. We achieved this by financing a stipend that enabled girls to attend school. But it is very difficult to maintain now under COVID. We have ambitious plan to extend gender parity and promote further gender development across a range of areas, and we have contributed this work. We know in many cases, women and girls may be more vulnerable to climate impacts. This is particularly because women are often family caregiver in our country and also in the context of South Asia. So when households are disrupted, their lives are more affected. Also because climate change exacerbates pre-existing hardship that exposes women and girls to different quite serious risks. When households and communities are forcibly displaced, which is increasingly happening with climate change. So part of climate justice will mean righting those wrongs and supporting gender justice that has been undermined due to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Abul. I'm now going to pass over and ask slightly longer questions to each of our three panelists. So we've already heard about the disproportionate impact on developing countries of the pollution and actions of more developed countries. So the perpetrators are passing their suffering onto other parts of the world, and the people in those parts of the world don't yet have a strong enough voice in order to be heard and for change to come. We've heard that from all three of our speakers. I think that's an important foundation for this discussion. So I'm going to ask a question now to Franceline. Franceline, can you tell us more about how the Philippines has coped with COVID, specifically in the space of continuing natural disasters and climate change, and how that has particularly affected women?
So as of today, it's been 100 days since the Philippine government imposed community quarantine to minimize the spread of novel coronavirus in the country. With the community quarantine came closure of mass transportation, closure of non-essential businesses, prohibition of mass gatherings, curfew and restriction of general movement within our own residences. Recently, CARE Philippines, together with 26 other INGOs, national NGOs, national government agencies, and UN agencies conducted a rapid gender analysis to reveal the gendered impacts of COVID-19. And they've reported that the top negative impact is on the economic welfare and mobility. There's also a marked increase in time spent for domestic and care work for primary household managers, which are mostly women. Women also continue to take this disproportionate share in taking on the burden marked by new longer hours for both domestic and care work, plus the added responsibility of infection prevention and community care work. We've also seen that hidden households like solo or young mothers rely heavily on the assistance coming from their own families because their invisibility prevents them from accessing assistance and support coming from the government. We've also seen that women are more aware of cases of violence against women and children in their communities, and they've seen gender-based violence case on the rise. However, there's a perception that the support needed for the victims of gender-based violence are missing because this support is inaccessible to victims due to mobility restrictions. And we've also seen that there's a rise in mental health issues as women try to cope not only with the burdens of the COVID-19 response, but also with the uncertainty on when the restrictions will be lifted and households and communities can go back to essentially their normal lives. Last May 14, Typhoon Wongfong made landfall in eastern Visayas or the eastern seaboard of the Philippines. As most of you may be aware, Philippines is one of we're favorites when it comes to typhoons, and we usually experience 20 tropical cyclones in a year. So Typhoon Wongfong was the first one we experienced, and we experienced this. And this is the first typhoon with everybody under community quarantine. As Typhoon Wongfong slowly made its way to the country, there was intense discussion happening within our local and national emergency responders. They're asking, how do we actually safely evacuate or implement our response protocols while strict COVID-19 protocols are still in place? How do we safely evacuate communities while following physical distancing rules? If we consider the elderly, the lactating and young mothers, the young children, and the immunocompromised to be the most vulnerable to COVID, is it safe for us to gather them in the same evacuation centers while strong rains and winds are happening outside? So these are critical questions that a lot of the emergency responders grappled a day or two before Typhoon Wongfong made landfall. And all of these these questions shifted our emergency responders to make new rules or new protocols. So what did they do? What did our responders do? What did the local governments and the local community decision makers do? So they've redesigned evacuation centers. So it would only house fewer families. They made sure that there are more wash facilities or at least more bars of soap available in evacuation centers. They've strengthened sanitation advocacy and sanitation messages, not only in the evacuation centers, but also in the communities. And then this was being delivered by community health workers, by the media, by local decision makers. Early warning messages included now reminders for communities not only to bring their go bags, but also to bring their face masks as they go out out of their houses and move to community spaces. As I've said, this is the first typhoon of the year, and we're expecting 18, 19 more in the next few months. And in the Philippines, it's not just typhoons. We also have earthquakes, we have volcanic eruptions, landslides, storm surges. All of these are possible disaster events. So given this and our continuing new normal due to COVID, there's an impetus for our decision makers to revise our response protocols, to revise how we communicate, to revise the actions needed to be done by community leaders, by households, by parents and children as we cope with all these disaster events. And we also need to consider other hazards like slow onset hazards and drought, given as these are possibilities in our country. So given this, there's a big push for our local governments to revisit how we do our response work, to revisit how we do our adaptation work, given that this is now the new normal. And we can expect more public health emergencies to happen in the next few years. That's it for me, Frances. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Franceline. That was really fascinating to hear about the different adaptations that you've been making, particularly recently in response to the typhoon, and just the impact, particularly gendered impact, that you're finding of COVID in the Philippines. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to hand over to Hilda now. So Hilda, I'd like to ask you, as a youth activist, why is it particularly important for young people and girls and young women in particular to advocate on climate change? And what's been the impact of COVID in those efforts?
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Hilda. Go ahead. And we've got your slide on the screen.
Well, to me, as a young activist, it is important because women and children are 14 times more likely to die because of climate change than men. This puts women on the vulnerability side of the scale, and therefore we need to fight more. My country, Uganda, has been recently hit by floods as a result of changes in rainfall patterns attributed to climate change. Several settlements on Lake Victoria, including other lakes and rivers in the country, have been washed away by floods, leading to several displacements of people, destruction of crops and other properties that include infrastructure, such as schools, roads, bridges, hospitals, among others. An estimated 173,000 people were affected by floods, and this figure is since May. So that means there are more and more numbers of people that are affected by floods up to now. Well, these people were forced to be relocated to temporary confinements for safety, and other people were made climate refugees because they didn't have where to stay. So such conditions of displacement and overcrowding in shelters will most definitely compromise the COVID-19 response measures of social distancing, among other measures. And furthermore, floods are known to trigger outbreaks of waterborne diseases and malaria, which compounds the vulnerabilities of the communities to COVID-19. In response to COVID-19, the Uganda National Meteorological Authority seasonal rainfall outlook says that these climate change effects are not about to stop. This means that floods are still affecting us, and they are as well affecting the efforts to deal with COVID-19 due to the displacement of people and the destruction of infrastructure, which includes hospitals. So such communities have to deal with both crises. Building resilience against them is therefore very crucial in order to save livelihoods. As a young woman and a victim of this climate crisis, I know what it means to be directly impacted by climate change. Therefore, I am on a mission to fight for our future. Climate injustice forced me to risk my education, to fight for everyone, and I rather fail my exams than fail my generation. as a young woman, it's important to advocate for climate action even when no one cares to pay attention, because as mothers, we are life givers. We have such a monumental relationship with the natural world, and we can draw on our experiences to provide solutions to a changing climate. Climate change can't be ranging across the globe, and we just keep quiet and keep our hands closed. Gone are the days when struggles were attributed to a certain gender. In the course of history, there comes a time when humanity is forced to shift to a new level of understanding. There's time when we have to hold each other's hands and give hope to each other. And I tell you that that time is now. The impact of COVID-19, I would say, many people's perception towards the environment has changed. We can see that many people across the world stayed home during the lockdown to stay safe, which led to a reduction in movement, bringing about a big carbon reduction. Many people resorted to walking and others cycling. Others are spending more time in agriculture, which is good for the climate as well. However, this massive disruption in our routine caused by the pandemic has come with an opportunity for us to move to a more sustainable lifestyle. But this will only happen if our leaders and the governments are willing to take decisive and concrete steps to encourage positive environmental changes that are enacted during lockdown. The response towards the coronavirus has shown us that the difference communities can make when they look out for each other. It has given us a lot more of hope that rapid action could also be taken on climate change the same way it is taken for COVID-19. Therefore, it's upon us to make concrete actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Hilda. I'm really struck by a couple of things that you said there, and I think what really cut through to me was you saying you would rather fail your exams than fail your generation. I think that's particularly inspiring, and that we should be holding each other's hands and giving hope to each other. There has been so much rapid change and adaptation to COVID, and it is a great reminder to us that we can change what we do and how we do it extremely quickly if we feel that we have to. So that sense of urgency on the climate needs to get through to leaders and to all of us. Thank you very much for that. My final question then in this section goes to Abul. Abul, could you talk to us about the Climate Vulnerable Forum's priorities related to climate justice and gender justice, please?
Thank you, Francis. Very relevant question. I pay my sincere thanks to the discussion from Francelina from Philippines and Hilda from Uganda. So thank you for this question. You see, the CVF, Climate Vulnerable Forum, Bangladesh took over just this presidency in the last month under this COVID. And the leaders of CVF in 2018, they recognized and affirmed this justice. Quote, the response to climate change was climate justice and social justice in action, almost which we are discussing today. So given gender justice is threatened by climate change, our first priority has been to take ambitious action at home to fight climate change. You can see this in our adaptation and disaster risk reduction program, which have been very successful in a number of our members like in Bangladesh. You see, last Amphan, just in the last month, it caused only less than 50 deaths. The same magnitude of cyclone in 1970 caused 300,000 to 500,000 deaths. Also, these CVF members have been leading the upgradation of our national climate efforts, our Paris Agreement indices, to increase national climate efforts. We will be calling on all countries to deliver stronger NDC this year as a matter of survival. Clearly, these will also be a matter of gender justice. We will also be seeking stronger demonstration of solidarity to help us fight the climate change. Our populations are heavily exposed and need support. People are being permanently displaced, which puts women and girls especially at risk. You see, we are doing all we can do with our own resources. We have our own climate trust fund, but it will not be sufficient. So we'll be working with the international community for support of these areas. We need to focus on securing enabling means where resources are lagging, shifting from a path of filled with vulnerability towards a path of resilience. Working as an international community, this is possible. Our CVF has the ambition, with support and ambitious effort from others, we might be surprised that what could be achieved. We also see climate justice and gender justice as a component of human rights issues, because climate change is a threat to fundamental human rights and gender justice too. Rights and the climate-based action likewise would help guide us to measure that will prevent rights being undermined. So the CBF leaders have also called for the establishment of even special rapporteur. This initiative could be very helpful in enabling the UN, and also we think a rapporteur can be a real drive of ambition to help protect those most vulnerable to climate threats, including especially women and children. So we hope to count on the support of different societies like UK, USA, and EU. Through our sister initiative, that is the Vulnerable Group of 20, V20, we hope to support CVF priorities through finance mobilization and policy endorsement to focus, stimulate investment, and mobilize new investment towards climate resilience. So achieving the triple dividend, this triple dividend is, that is the reducing pandemic risk, while at the same time increasing climate resilience and strengthening economic recovery and sustained growth. So achieving this triple dividend must be protected those most vulnerable, which includes women and children. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Abul. That's fascinating to hear about the rights-based approach that you're taking and the importance of the significant impact that climate justice can have on the realization of access to other rights, and the importance of coalitions demanding those changes. Thank you very much for that indeed. I'm going to pose one final question to our first three speakers and ask them each to respond to that just in 3 minutes each. So our final question for our first three speakers is that as the world focuses on economic recovery from COVID-19, what action do you want governments to take to ensure that the climate crisis is still a priority and to ensure that women's leadership is central in shaping recovery plans? So if I can pose that first to Francine, please.
Yes. I think that we hope that local and national governments, national and international development organizations, and donors would consider the following recommendations to ensure that we do not lose women leadership and climate resilience in any COVID recovery. First is, we encourage all governments to revisit their adaptation plans now. As the world radically changed in the last few months, our disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation plans must be revised as well. We always say that good plans are based on accurate and timely data. Data culled from the most vulnerable, including women and children. For our DRRM plans, we need to factor in public health emergencies and outbreaks as one of the hazards we need to prepare for and anticipate. We need to consider how potential impacts of climate change can aggravate future public health emergencies. I think this is something that our local government partners, we've been hearing this in the Philippines from our local government partners, and they're slowly seeking support from INGOs and the national governments to provide insights on how to go about this. And I think this is something that we can focus our energies on now. Second is, we need to ensure that any COVID economic recovery plans would not only include social protection measures, but would actually create resources for the most vulnerable households. Resilient livelihood initiatives should be in place, targeting the most vulnerable communities in the country. This would ensure that they would have enough capacities to absorb and mitigate future shocks and stresses brought about by future disasters and climate change. Creating resources in the households would also minimize the burden for women who are the primary carers as they carry the burden or the impacts of future disaster events. And lastly, I think we need to continue keeping all pathways and platforms for women participation and engagement open and functional. From the feedback boxes in our community to the text lines and the hotline numbers, we need to ensure that women's needs, concerns, opinions, and voices can reach the appropriate decision makers. It is only through continuous women engagement and leadership that we can ensure that the experiences and the future generations of women and girls would be transformed for the better. So that's it for me. Thank you, Frances.
Thank you so much for that, Franceline. So the same question then to Hilda, please. What action would you want governments to take to ensure the climate crisis is still a priority and to ensure that women's leadership is present in the shaping of recovery plans?
Thank you, Francis. I think we, the people and the government or our leaders, know what to do. The problem has never been what to do. The problem is that there is no political will. Well, there's a lot to do. For example, I agree with Franceline when she said that they need to revisit their adaptation plans. Well, I would give a few things like investing in healthcare systems that address both climate change and COVID-19 in order to build resilience to climate change and pandemics. And like I said, governments should take decisive and concrete steps to encourage positive environmental changes enacted during the lockdown. I would say effective disaster management and preparedness is also key in dealing with such crises. And also making fossil fuel companies accountable for the damage they have caused. Governments or our leaders should stop financing fossil fuel companies and adapt renewable energy, because renewable energy is way, way cheaper and it is good for the environment in turn. They should also prioritize climate justice in our countries and communities with women and youth inclusion in national climate plans. And they need to put, we need to push for better legislation to keep the companies that abuse human rights in check and also demand better from them. Government needs to support working groups so that we can, to support working groups so that they can make change on the ground. And also our leaders need to know that it's upon them to take these decisive steps so that we achieve resilience. And I would end with a quote from Natalie Isaacs that says that they need to put up people and the planet before profit. by discovering the connection with Earth, we need to discover our connection with the Earth and come to love it in the same way we love our family and loved ones, because we fight for what we love. If there is one thing that will strengthen your determination to take lasting action on climate change, it's the beautiful world around us. So our leaders need to discover that, that Earth, that connection between them and our Earth, and they need to love that Earth so that they can fight for it. With fighting, I mean they can take decisive steps to make selfless decisions that will enable us reach a resilient and future, or a positive environmental change. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Hilda. That was incredibly interesting, and I think where you speak so passionately about the need for inclusion in decision making, and particularly for women and young people, I think that resonates very strongly with everything that we've been talking about. And I really love your analogy about needing our leaders to fall in love with the planet in order to feel the desire to protect it. Thank you very much for that. So finally, the question to Abul. So Abul, what would you be asking what action would you be asking governments to take to ensure the climate crisis is still a priority and to ensure women's leadership in shaping the recovery plans?
Thank you. This is vital that the climate change and gender transformative approaches do not take a backseat because of the pandemic. Previous experience with economic systems and nature harmful approaches demonstrate that the great and growing need of move away rapidly from the anonymous thinking and pledge the past, of which has brought about the current global confrontation with multiple crises and increased injustice, including gender inequalities. So opportunities to place resilience and climate justice firmly at the center of the table of public policy atmosphere, and alongside green public finance stimulus to significant and vulnerable countries, they can need to take advantage of the spaces. As this COVID-19 has compounded vulnerabilities of countries, and especially women, the need for more urgent climate action has become even greater. Although the economic downturn remains a significant constraint of marshalling resources, the CVF and V20 countries to provide compelling partnership opportunities for resilience and development among vulnerable countries with major economies. We must endeavor to adaptation yield, also welfare effects to be gender transformative, and triple dividend, as I mentioned in the last slide, to reduce pandemic risk, accelerate economic recovery and growth, and enable climate resilience. While we aim to create a new shield of global protection, equipping countries and the most vulnerable, especially women and girls, with financial instruments that help to embrace a new risk management paradigm in view of climate change. A paradigm shift must bring resilience, investment, and stability to small business and vulnerable people. Finally, the CVF and B20 forward to continuing the engaging with partners here today to build investment opportunities and sustained economic growth and climate justice for vulnerable countries and people. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Abul. I think it's really valuable to have that intergovernmental approach included in this discussion, and I think that emphasis that you give around the opportunity for climate just partnership and investment and economic policy as part of the economic and the social recovery is a really vital point if we want to create significant change. So thank you very much. We're at the halfway point, so we're going to switch over to our second group of 3 speakers. So my thanks to Franceline and Hilda and Abul, and we'll be coming back to them at the end of the session when we move to the Q&A. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our next 3 speakers. So again, I'll just give you a quick overview of each of them, and then I'll start handing over to questions. So our next speaker will be Tasneem Essop. Tasneem is the Executive Director of the Climate Action Network International. She's also serving her 2nd term as Commissioner in the National Planning Commission in South Africa, appointed by the President, where she leads the work on climate change and the just transition. Tasneem has previously been a minister in the Provincial Parliament in the Western Cape and headed the climate team in WWF International, representing them as head of delegation at the UN. Our second panelist in this section will be Camilla Bourne. Camilla is the Deputy Strategy Director in the COP26 unit in the Cabinet Office in the UK government. She is an expert, activist and analyst in climate diplomacy with particular expertise in climate security, adaptation and climate risk management. Prior to this role, she led the development of the UK's approach to adaptation and resilience for the UN Climate Action Summit at the UK Department for International Development. Camilla is seconded from the climate think tank E3G and is also chair of Climate Outreach, which is Europe's leading climate communication organisation. So welcome to Camilla. And our third panellist is Edith Ofwona Adera. Edith is Principal Climate Change and Green Growth Officer in the Department of Climate Change and Green Growth at the African Development Bank Group, where she leads climate change mainstreaming work in Anglophone West Africa. She previously managed the Acacia programme at Canada's International Development Research Centre, pioneering research on the transformative effects of ICTs on climate change, agriculture and the environment. She's an agricultural scientist and economist by training, and Edith is frequently called upon by UNFCCC to co-facilitate and engage in global climate change sessions. So a very warm welcome to our 3 panelists. And we're going to start with a question to each of them. So slightly different format here. We're going to ask each person to speak for 6 or 7 minutes in response to a question, and we will then come on after that to questions from all of you. So Tasneem, if I can pose our first question to you, which is, what do CAN members want to see and what are they asking of governments, citizens and the private sector?
Thank you very much, Francis, and hello to everybody. It's a real privilege to follow on from Franceline, Hilda and Abul, and I want to thank CARE for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. So, Francis, just before I get into your specific question about what CAN members are calling for, I'd like to reflect a little bit about the previous conversation that we've had. And it's been really useful to hear very practical experiences and perspectives from Hilda, Franceline and Abul in their context. Clearly the connections between the pandemic, the climate emergency, and of course, gender justice is exposed in a very concrete way. I want to add another dimension that we have to factor in if we are going to come with meaningful interventions to address the issue of gender justice. And that is something that has emerged. You know, we've experienced what the pandemic has exposed, but we have also now witnessed in the growing movements around Black Lives Matter that there are differentiated experiences when it comes to these crises, the pandemic, the climate emergency, etc. And we have to be deliberative in our approach to solutions to address these injustices. And we have to recognize that, in fact, it is Black people, Indigenous peoples, and people of color who are actually on the front lines of these these emergencies, these pandemics, these crises. And again, it has laid bare fundamentally the issue of inequality, of poverty that these communities experience throughout the world, and especially in the global south. And I think Hilda and Abul and Francine pointed out that matter. So I do want to add the racial dimension, and I think very explicitly also the socio-economic dimension. And it is important for us to recognize there would be a differentiated experience of crises within those dimensions. So I'd like to put that as an important additional item for us to consider in the overall conversation about gender justice and justice in terms of climate as well. So what are we asking for as the Climate Action Network? We recognize that, of course, the immediate needs in terms of responses is to ensure the safety of our people. And government's responses would have to address both the kind of emergency responses that we are experiencing in many places in the world related to climate, as well as the pandemic. This pandemic has not hit the pause button on climate, as we so clearly heard the experience of flooding in Uganda and how it's exacerbated the dealing with the pandemic, the experiences of typhoons in the Philippines, etc. And we've been witnessing these extreme weather events while we're living through this challenging times of the pandemic. So the governments are involved in, of course, the immediate response measures, but they're also planning for the recovery, as they call it, and the stimulus packages that they're putting in place. Unfortunately, as they are now presented, will not set us on a path to deal with the kind of resilience that we need to be building to address all kinds of emergencies and to address all kinds of injustice. They're clearly looking at supporting what we call business as usual. So the kinds of industries and sectors that caused many of the problems that we're experiencing with climate change are being supported through these stimulus packages. We believe that this is an important opportunity, in fact, to do a reset or a reboot, that we could use this amazing amount of money that suddenly governments have been finding in this pandemic, and what we've been calling on for a long time to be spent to address the climate emergency. We think that this now presents that opportunity. And so when we're dealing with the recovery, it would be important in the planning for that recovery to actually put at the center the needs of Black, if you planned for a Black woman and child, a person of color, a woman of color and a child of color, you're lifting up all ships. So if the recovery can actually center the needs of women, vulnerable, poor, working class, women and children, then we will have a recovery that in fact deals with gender injustice. And that includes things, this is not rocket science. Hilda says that we have these solutions, we've been having these solutions for decades already. But if you, for example, just dealt with the issue of poverty and inequality that we're experiencing around the world and in the global south, where you address the basic social needs like health, access to health, having energy access and addressing energy poverty. If you look at housing and settlements and spatial justice, for example, you'll go a long way also to address resilience. If you look at our transport systems and invest more in public transport rather than private transport, that goes a long way in addressing poverty and inequality, and in that way builds resilience, and especially for women and girls. When we look at our food systems and to ensure that, you know, this is not just big agriculture, but our smallholders, and there are specifically women, that we invest in that that would also be supporting justice, gender justice in a recovery period. So really, if we're looking at this recovery that governments are planning, we have the opportunity to, as I said, shift investments now. But that's going to take citizens to stand up and be heard, and especially women leading that fight. It's not going to be something that businesses or governments will automatically just give up and do. As Hilda says, we need political will. We need to fight for that. And so my call on citizens, and especially women, is to lead this fight. We do have to have our voices heard, and we can have our voices heard, as Hilda so eloquently demonstrated. So I think this is a transformational moment. It is a really critical time to get that transformation right and to ensure that that transformation fundamentally puts gender justice at its center. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Tasneem, and thank you for explicitly articulating the question about race and racism in this topic. It's important to have that very firmly on the table, so thank you for bringing that into the discussion so clearly. And also for that rallying cry at the end that this is going to need to be a citizen-driven change. We can't leave it all to government. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to pose my second question now to Camilla Bourne. Camilla, as the UK is preparing to hold presidency of COP26 and G7 next year, what leadership will the UK be providing to address these issues?
Thank you, Frances, and thanks to all my fellow panelists. It's been really illuminating to hear the different insights, and I think, you know, built out that practical rationale for delivery, and then I think very effectively Tasneem translated that into some galvanizing understanding of where next. And I couldn't agree more that there is a big opportunity with the Green Resilient Recovery. And I think gender should absolutely be at the heart of that. And that is something we are considering, and would also invite you all to hold us accountable for and help us in working out where we can be most effective in taking that forward. So from our perspective, a gender inclusive COP is a prerequisite for a successful COP. And we are well aware of that. The evidence shows that if women and girls are involved in leadership in climate action, you have a more successful approach to climate action, you have better, more inclusive and equitable work associated with climate action. And we know that we need to take climate out of a box where it lives on its own and bring it much more to the forefront of what is the day-to-day challenges and opportunities that we heard. And I found that really encouraging in the panel so far, that we have talked about the particular vulnerabilities that women and girls experience, and that's incredibly important we highlight. But we've also flagged the leadership opportunities and the contribution that constituency can bring. This isn't just something that we have to worry about. It's an opportunity to seize and something to be worked with to yield the best outcomes possible. So in this question about leadership, I will do the right thing and actually answer the question. Where are we showing leadership? So I wanted to speak across 4 different clusters of things that we consider the need to take leadership. So the first is unsurprising. It is COP26 and the negotiations themselves. So my colleagues, and I would just like to take a moment to celebrate my very brilliant colleagues. There are some incredible female, also male, and other genders colleagues who I work with in the negotiations team who are phenomenal, and they really put their shoulder to the wheel around the Gender Action Plan in Madrid and see that as a really considerable victory, and something that they want to make sure that they're furthering opportunities in that space. I think we're also aware that we want to make sure that the COP itself is a gender inclusive space, and we would welcome your thoughts and ideas on how we can effectively facilitate that. We want to make sure that we are supporting networks of female leadership, be they through the formal negotiations, be they through other constituencies that are engaging during the COP. And we'd welcome your examples of best practice so that we can make the most of those 2 weeks and take that inclusive approach. Of course, you'll know that we had to postpone the COP in reasons of health and inclusivity, and therefore we want to make sure that we do fulfill that need for an inclusive COP, and we do deliver when we come to Glasgow in 2021. So again, would welcome your views and thoughts on how we can most effectively do that. The second piece where we are showing leadership is in the programs that we deliver around climate action. That's domestically as well as internationally, and it's absolutely the case. And the speakers have said it so eloquently that COVID-19 has exacerbated a number of the gender inequalities that we see already, and climate change, we know, compounds them only further. So we are very aware that we want to bring women's leadership across the different programs that we deliver and policies that we deliver around climate action, be they related to disaster risk reduction, adaptation in the UK as well as internationally, if it is in engineering, in technology related low carbon and resilient transition, or if it's in the broader work that is certainly expanding in recent months and years around nature and how those link together with climate, which I would note there's been a lot of leadership in the developing world, which I think a lot of the developed world can learn from, and we're really keen to facilitate that kind of broad knowledge sharing across different constituencies, and making sure that we're profiling the importance of women in that space, given we know how much value add women and girls are playing in that space. Then if we move into my third cluster of area, we're showing leadership or intending to show leadership. And again, I invite you to hold us accountable to it, and to make sure that you're flagging to us where you think we can do more, because it's only together that we'll be able to most effectively achieve that. And that's through policy decision making. So that's the UNFCCC outcomes, but it's also how we make progress in the G7, as is pointed out in this question, and also the GCF and other bodies. How are we making sure that gender is integrated into that programming? I think we've seen really bold steps in the recent years, and really the mainstreaming of gender, and it's taken its time, but it's definitely making a critical difference. But there's always more to be done, and I think we are keen to be as innovative and creative as possible in that space, and bring gender considerations into the way that we take this work forward. And then the fourth piece I would say is around our communications and public engagement. We really value having that diversity at the forefront of our presidency, and we're really keen to be able to do that. I think sometimes when we think about leadership of women and girls on climate, we conjure up a certain image of it. And I want to say that leadership is actually, it's very diverse, it's very broad, it crops up in all manner of different spaces. And I think we're really keen to elevate that diversity. And this isn't just the role of activists, this is also the role of policymakers like myself, or it's the role of the school teacher who is interacting with their class, or it is the role of a woman who is working in an engineering firm. We need that diversity in what we're bringing to showing what climate action is really about. We're taking it out of that silo and bringing it into that broader space. And we're keen to make that visible. And again, would welcome your ideas on doing that. Gender inclusivity is really important to us having successful COP, as I said, and it is something we are holding high in the way that we approach our work. I think often these kind of we can have our sort of focus things, but sometimes we struggle to always bring into the broader conversation at times. And again, we'll just invite you to keep us accountable to that. It is our intention. We do have that political will that was talked about. We want to do this, and it is fantastic to have such a conversation with so many experts and those who are firmly pushing in this direction, so that we can share in this endeavour and lead towards a truly gender inclusive COP at the end of 2021 next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Camilla. It's really encouraging to hear the strength of commitment that the UK government is very publicly making about mainstreaming gender across its presidencies next year. And I'm sure we will all take on the challenge of holding you and your colleagues accountable on that, and engaging with you to help you to achieve that ambition. So thank you very much indeed for being with us today and for sharing that. Our final contribution in this section is from Edith Adera from the African Development Bank. Edith, I'd like to ask you what direction the African Development Bank is taking in COVID recovery, and how the issues of climate justice and gender justice will feature, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I just want, before I go into what the bank is doing, I just want to touch on two important issues. The panel has been very rich in terms of the issues that they've brought to the fore, very practical issues that are happening on the ground. Just two elements that I'd like to add to our discussion is actually the impact that COVID has had on the young people, both young men and women, and how many of them are likely, especially for young girls, are probably not likely to go back to school, depending on the impact that it has had on them, especially those who found themselves in situations where, for example, they've had unwanted pregnancies. So I think we need to also look at the impact on young people. The statistics show that about 40% of those who were working before the lockdown were actually in hard-hit sectors, which means that they're likely probably not to find jobs for those who have lost jobs. And we risk having a lockdown generation. So focusing on the youth is also critical. A second element for me, when I look at the issue that we're addressing today in terms of looking at COVID, looking at the gender issues and also climate, I actually see them as very intertwined. And we ask ourselves, why are we in COVID today? And we need to remember that it's, if you look at the diseases around the world, about 60% of diseases are zoonotic, and COVID is a zoonotic disease, really driven by environmental changes and encroachment into animal habitat. And there's also increasing evidence and scientific evidence of the link between climatic changes, environmental changes, and zoonotic diseases. So really, it's not just about that it's exacerbating, climate is exacerbating the situation, but actually we found ourselves because of an environmental issue. So I see the issue that we're discussing today as a triple crisis. We're dealing with the COVID crisis, we're also dealing with the climate crisis and the existing gender inequalities. And actually this year was an incredible year for both gender equality as well as climate ambition. So from our perspective, it's important to address it from a holistic perspective. And I see this as an issue that we need to look at from a point of view of a whole of system approach, not just to deal with the current pandemic, but actually to deal with the systemic risks that we are facing. So at the bank, we are very cognizant of this, that we not only need to respond and provide support to our regional member countries to address the pandemic, but also to look at, from a systemic point of view, how can we build resilience? How do we build back better and build back greener? Because this provides us with a very good opportunity to do business differently going forward. So aware of this, the bank has actually put in place a COVID-19 response facility. It's a $10 billion response facility, which is addressing the immediate needs to contain the pandemic, but at the same time, we are greening as much as we can the response measures. And we're doing this in a very systematic way, addressing a couple of areas that are very critical. Some of the things that we are supporting in our response measures is providing support for renewable energy for health centers. We know that about only 30% of health centers in Africa have access to reliable electricity. So when it comes to addressing the pandemic, in centers that really don't have the facilities, it becomes very challenging and in being able to respond. Another area that's very critical is that agriculture has been highly affected by the lockdowns and also climatic challenges. And I think a number of the panelists actually talked about the climate disasters that are going on. We have drought in the Sahel, we have floods in East Africa, we have the desert locust that has been ravaging East Africa. So we're actually juggling many balls. It's not just the COVID ball, but also the climate ball and other issues. So a holistic approach to responding to the pandemic is the approach that we are taking. And therefore, we are also providing support for climate smart agricultural interventions, particularly in the Sahel, to avert hunger. And this is really targeting women farmers as well, who are quite affected, and also supporting sustainable water and sanitation solutions. These are just some of the practical examples, in addition to saving jobs, ensuring that we address the impact and livelihoods that have been affected. So our response at the immediate level is to focus on responding to the pandemic, but at the same time, ensuring future resilience. And Abul mentioned the need to build long-term resilience. So while we are addressing the current issues, we're also looking at long-term. How do we build resilience to ensure that the investments that are going in are actually creating a very solid green foundation to actually build back better and to ensure sustainability in the future? So in Africa, one of the sectors that are very critical is the energy sector that really drives development. And so we are looking at gender-sensitive renewable energy investments that are supporting delivery of green jobs, clean and affordable power, and also addressing energy security. And we know that with energy security, you're able to address, especially when you're dealing with renewable energy, you're able to address the health impacts of polluting energy, and you're also able to address the kind of investment and infrastructure that's required for future development. So we have a unique initiative, which is called the Desert to Power Initiative. This is an initiative that's covering the whole of Sahel to actually build solar solutions that would reach about 250 million people. And 90 million of those are actually going to be connected for the first time and lifting them out of poverty. So these are some of the measures that we are putting in place. And we believe that it's important to address them so that we are not only looking at the pandemic now, but addressing some of the critical climate and gender-related challenges that we are facing, so that going forward, you're able to build on a more solid foundation and not do business as usual, like has been the case in the past. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Edith. That was really interesting to hear about that. And I think the commitments that we're seeing from the bank about building back better and building back greener, and about recognizing that we can't just tackle COVID as an isolated issue, we need to be looking much more holistically, is very encouraging and very interesting for us to be hearing about today. Thank you very much to all 6 of the speakers we've heard from. We now have just a few minutes, about 10 or 15 minutes for questions from all of you who've been listening in. And as we explained at the beginning, we've collated some questions from the chat. So thank you very much to everyone who put questions in there. And I will pose those questions to our panel. I'm going to start with a question for Hilda, if I may. It's a question from Rosie from Natural Capital Partners. And she asks what you're doing right now within the restrictions of COVID to raise awareness of the action that needs to be taken among government, companies and communities. So I guess it's a question about what you're able to be doing under COVID in terms of your campaigning and your activism.
Thank you, Francisca. Thank you for the question. Well, what I am doing during this COVID-19 is, first of all, I continue with the online climate mobilizations in the different parts of the country. We are in contact with other climate activists from other different parts of the country that help us mobilizing more people so that they can join the movement and also to carry out more climate action. And I also continue to create wide climate awareness through carrying out digital climate strikes as usual, because right now we are in a lockdown, but we transform to the digital climate strikes that is every Friday, and also reminding our leaders that we have a future to protect, that we continue to request for what climate action or climate justice, and through their actions. Also, we are, as Fridays for Future Uganda, we are running an emergency youth-led COVID-19 program that is helping and supporting people who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and also to the problems that COVID-19 is bringing. For example, children, for example, flood victims, victims of landslides, victims of displacement caused to the different effects of climate change. And also, I continue to encourage other people to stand up and fight for a just recovery, and also to fight for a greener recovery, and also to remind our governments, leaders, that we deserve better, we deserve a better world, we deserve a better future. So we continue to push our governments to action. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Hilda. It's really encouraging to see how much you've been able to do despite all of the restrictions. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. The second question we have, I'm going to throw open to the panel. I think we've probably got time for perhaps two of our panelists to respond to it. And the question is that women's rights organisations and other actors in many countries have achieved a great deal to promote both gender and climate justice. Given the urgency of the climate crisis and the complexities brought by COVID-19, both exposing inequalities beyond gender, what do we need to do differently so we do not go back to normal as feminists and activists? So I guess this is really a question about what we've learned from this experience, what we're going to have to do differently as we go forward, kind of accepting that we won't be going back to what we used to think of as normal. We have a different normality to embrace now. So what should we be doing differently as feminists and activists? And also, what are the responsibilities of the global north in doing that? I wonder who might want to jump in on that. Tasneem, perhaps?
Thanks, Francis. I'll try to respond. So I think that the one thing that we've learned is not to take victories that we have won for granted, and that we have to be constantly vigilant, as we have witnessed in the past while, under the veil of a crisis like this, and this would be the same for any crisis. Many of the rights that we have won are being rolled back. So, for example, the attempt for, in the US, under very toxic male leadership, the attempt to roll back reproductive rights of women at least was thwarted by the justice system. And so that's a victory. But again, the potential for that right to have been rolled back is very real and would happen in an emerging, I would call autocratic or right-wing political environment. And so we have to be vigilant. That's the one thing that we always have to be aware of as activists, as feminists. The second thing is, for us, we use the label feminist in a way that is as if all, and I've raised this issue in my intervention, that we have to recognize the differentiated experiences of women and children to be truly and deliberatively conscious of the solutions that we are putting in place and the rights that we are needing to be fighting for. I think that the one thing that I worry about the most now is, in fact, this rising, what we experiencing as toxic male leadership in the world. It is a deep concern because it affects us as women, of course, but it affects all human rights as a whole, and the rollback of those freedoms and rights that we have taken for granted in our democracies. So I think that kind of dude culture that we're starting to see emerge is a huge threat. And it's going to be up to us to actually fight that. It's not going to be, people in power, men in power do not hand over power. It is the power of all of us, women and people generally, that will have to fight for those rights to be protected and to roll back also the kind of pushback that we're experiencing under these, the veil of the crises, the pandemic, the climate emergency. So for me, it is keep your power, use your power, and remain vigilant to not let these rights be trampled on and rolled back. Thanks, Francis.
Thanks so much for that, Tasneem. I think it's a really, we must all pay very close attention during this crisis when so much emergency action, emergency powers are being taken by governments, which can very easily be used as a mechanism to roll back on freedoms. As you say, some of which we thought we had won, but we're learning are easily stripped away if we don't fight very hard. So thank you very much for that. It's a really important reminder. Would one or two of the other panelists be interested in responding to that question as well? Let's see if I can spot anyone. Franceline, did you want to come in on that in terms of your experience?
Hi everyone. I think for me, what we can consider moving forward is basically we should not minimize. For us not to go back to we should not minimize women's burdens and women's contribution. I think we need to continue emphasizing how the impacts of COVID, of disasters, of climate change affect women and find ways to address it. And secondly, we should continue women leadership, not only for the women and girls who are active now, but for future generations. It is as feminists, it is our duty to ensure that the future generations can actively participate in spaces, can lead communities, and draw the kind of community, the kind of world we all wish to be in. And I think we should learn from the mistakes, and we should learn from our small wins for us to really push forward. Thank you, Frances.
Thank you so much for that. That's a really helpful contribution to that. Thank you so much, Franceline. And I'm just thinking we have time for one more question, which is for Camilla about COP, but we may, if we get time, also widen it to include Edith in relation to the Africa Development Bank. So the question is about sustainable financing. This is a key component to achieving gender and climate change justice, as we've seen. So starting with Camilla, do you see the next COP addressing sustainable financing? And what kind of leadership do you think is needed to ensure that it's on the COP agenda?
Thanks, and good question. And I'm afraid I won't be able to speak to all the policy specifics on that. But what I will say is that we are taking our role as COP presidents very seriously, in that we see our role as to be custodians of the Paris Agreement and custodians of the UNFCCC. So that means coming good on those goals that are enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which includes long-term goals on mitigation and adaptation, but it also includes that long-term goal on finance, including shifting financial flows. And as we've said, you know, we recognise the leadership of women and girls in delivering climate action. And so it's an interesting question to think, okay, what is the role of gender in that level of policy making? I can't pretend I'm an expert in it, but what I will say is that I think there's something interesting to be explored there. One of the most effective ways to think about how we integrate these pieces is to look at specific policies and think what would be the value add of bringing a gender component into it. And so perhaps an exercise that I can take back to my colleagues is that this has been flagged and that it might be worth them thinking through where that could specifically feature. If those who asked the question are interested, I'd be happy to connect you up for a more detailed answer rather than a conceptual one at this point.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Camilla. Edith, did you want to come in then on that question?
Yeah, sure. Sustainable financing is absolutely critical. If you look at the requirements now, I think Africa only gets 3% of the global climate finance. So at the bank, we are taking climate finance seriously. So 40%, actually our target is to get to 40% of our allocated financing is actually determined as climate finance. In addition to that, we are working with our partners as well to mobilize finance. And I think a majority of the finance beyond just the public financing, we also need to look at private financing. So actually mobilizing private finance to support adaptation is important. And I think from the panelists, especially Hilda, she mentioned the importance of building resilience in countries that are most affected, and therefore looking beyond public financing to mobilizing private financing is very critical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Edith. That's really, I think, reassuring to be hearing about that percentage commitment and the extent of the designation of funding. Thank you very much for that indeed. Our time is up. It is 12 o'clock here in London. So I want to give a very warm thank you to all 6 of our panelists today. Your contributions have been incredibly insightful and challenging and have inspired a lot of fresh thought. And I want to thank all of the people who joined the session today. We had well over 100 people joining us for this discussion, and it's great to have had you involved. You'll see on your screen now details of where you can access the recording of this session, and I'd encourage you to share it with your contacts. We'd be grateful if you would do that. But I think that all that remains for me to do is to thank everybody involved. I'd like to particularly thank a couple of my colleagues at CARE, Sherry and Francesca, who did an awful lot of work behind the scenes to put this together and bring together such a great panel of people. And to our 6 brilliant panelists for joining us today, and to all of you for contributing your questions and your comments and your thoughts. So thank you very much indeed, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again at future events. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abul, Ramsaleen, Hilda, Edith.
Thank you. Bye.
So thank you so much.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.